also to show the work we're doing. I should also say that as a general rule, and since there are 5 businesses here, we generally don't chat about the businesses that are in the process of conversion until they've converted and they are happy to have the press release. So if you want to have us do non-disclosure agreements, we're happy to sign those. If you want other people in this room to sign them, we can talk about that. Basically, I'm under the assumption that what we say in these group sessions stay in the group session for the most part. We won't really be recording the question and answer part, mainly just the presentation part. So, but you can contact me at my email, and we can set up a formal non-disclosure agreement if you'd like. Okay, well, I think I am going to dive into the presentation here, and we'll see where we go. And I should also say we're planning for 2 hours for each session, but I've never believed we should stay online just to stay online. So, I build in the time for questions and answer and discussion. So depending on where we get every day we'll end when it's either at the 2 hours or when it's time to end. So let me set up my screen here. Okay, so today is really talking about co-op basics and cooperative organization, to kind of let you know what you're getting into and what to expect from it all. Maybe answer some of the questions of how it works. First talking about kind of what is a cooperative, a quick history of where cooperatives come from, what we call the cooperative identity. Talk about there's several different legal structures that you can work with cooperatives in Washington. We'll go through a brief summary of each of them, and then talk about the next steps, and also a discussion about vision and mission. And then if there are any questions, if there are clarifying questions, simply put them in the chat, and Sam or Diane can interrupt me and we'll stop and clarify those questions. Otherwise, we'll take a lot of questions at the end as well. And if there's any discussion, or if there's any other work that you want or things you want to get done today, we can always work on that depending on the time. So first of all, co-ops are a really big part of the US economy. They are pretty much everywhere, although we don't always see them because they don't always identify as well. So this screen, I just have a bunch of different names that are kind of, pretty big companies. Not all of them are co-ops, but it gives you a sense of where they are. So if you're thinking like, how can you tell if how you know which one's a co-op or not? By their logo, you're probably not going to know. But once you look into their structure, you can see there are some there's still a lot of household names. So like Liberty Mutual, Thriftway, which is a Washington-based cooperative. Ace Hardware is like Ace Hardware. They're service co-ops where the individual stores are the members of the co-op. Liberty Mutual is an insurance company. Pretty much anytime you see mutual in the name of an insurance company, it's operated on a cooperative basis. And even big names like Welch's and Sunkist have started out as cooperatives, and started out really much like we're starting out today with you, with a small group of farmers that came together to try to get a better deal in the marketplace. And 100 years later, they're household names. So there are different types of co-ops. The producer co-ops are like Organic Valley and Welch's, and where the individual farms are the members, and they are combined together to market their product under a common brand. And often the producer co-op will also do some of the processing. So Organic Valley helps process the milk of the producers and cheese. And markets it throughout the nation. Mentioned insurance co-ops, also financial co-ops like credit unions are operated on that same cooperative principle of one member, one vote, and some of the other aspects we'll go to. Most people are pretty familiar, I think, with consumer co-ops if they think about co-ops. So grocery stores are really big, and they between the grocery stores and the ag co-ops probably and make up most of what people probably think of when they think about co-ops. But there's also housing co-ops, such as our resident-owned cooperative program that works with manufactured home parks and helps convert them to cooperative ownership. And then, of course, worker co-ops, where the workers are the member base. So the type of co-op is ultimately based on who the members are. And then that kind of decides which category we put it into. But pretty much co-ops can operate in anywhere in the economic sector. It's just a matter of how you organize and determine who the members is. And one of the discussions that you'll be having this week is deciding, how you're going to define your membership, and whether that's going to be strictly workers of the business, or if it might be include also consumers as well, or other stakeholder groups. So in Olympia, we have converted businesses. We use the term conversion here, is that they were businesses under another legal structure, and at some point over the last several years, they decided to transition over to the cooperative model. So the oldest one here is New Moon Cafe, which I forget when, I think it was 2013 they converted. And since then, they were joined by Dumpster Values, Burial Grounds, Orca Books, and Working Systems. Interestingly, these are all downtown businesses that are within about 5 blocks of each other. And so it's also one of the things that we really, and I think the city really looks at, it's a way of really preserving the character of our downtown by keeping businesses into helping them become cooperatives, which hopefully means that they will be there perpetually and continue to be part of the downtown identity, along with keeping those jobs intact and even being able to expand those jobs. So what is the cooperative model? Historically, I like to say it's really a form of mutual aid. Cooperatives in some form or another go back hundreds, if not thousands of years of people coming together to meet their common needs, and doing so in a way that's respectful of the members and in terms of how they relate to each other and such. The modern cooperative movement, we usually see as a response to the Industrial Revolution, that the way that work was changed and reorganized led to people needing to find a different economic model than the one being presented to them by the industrialists. And this kind of led up to, and it's inspired, the Rockdale Society of Pioneers, which formed in 1844 outside Manchester, in the UK, and really is what's kind of considered to be the start of the modern cooperative movement, in which consumers and workers came together as members of the store and were able to source and supply and get supplies for their personal needs. Typical grocery store, but also had some worker elements as well. So in terms of economics, there's what defines a co-op and is kind of also on who benefits and the basis that it works on. So a traditional investor model that we think of as traditional today is where it benefits the shareholders, whereas for a cooperative, it's about the user members. So the purpose of the co-op is for meeting member needs. Likewise, a not-for-profit like Northwest Co-op Development Center, the people who benefit from NWCDC or 501c3s would be the community as a whole, the community that they're serving, but also the surrounding community. And then finally, kind of the other economic model is sort of planned, and that's the government that is engaging its economic activity to benefit citizens. So the basis for each is also a little bit different. Investor-owned businesses are about maximizing return on investment and also the rate of growth of that investment. Government, on the other hand, is based on taxes and user fees. And then in the middle of there, we have not-for-profits that are looking at a positive cash flow. So it's not that they don't make a profit or show a surplus, but they still have to be able to cover their bills and capital costs. And then cooperatives, I tend to like the term cost neutral, Too often, cooperatives kind of get mushed into the not-for-profit world, and people get confused by what the distinctions between that. So the purpose of a cooperative is to meet its costs, and that means its operational and its capital costs. And if there's money left over, we tend to call it a surplus as opposed to a profit, because the purpose isn't to make a profit. The purpose is to meet the member needs. And so again, it's the distinction from, say, a cooperative and a not-for-profit and an investor-owned business. Again, investor and co-ops are both market-based organizations. They are existing in places where there's a market demand. The investor world, it might be, sometimes use the term market failure because investors don't see that market as valuable enough to invest in. Cooperatives are sometimes framed as addressing market failures because they don't have that profit motive, that they're about meeting needs, so they're able to work at a lower profit margin and still engage in the marketplace. And then, of course, the government and not-for-profits have more of a planned sort of budgeting and an economy, but also dabble in the market-based world too. And then finally, the core focus of each, again, the best interest of the shareholders is the investors model. Co-ops have a universal situation of values and principles, and identity, which we will talk about in a few minutes. For not-for-profits, mission is really kind of key. It's part of how they're able to define their status with the terms of tax exemption. And then, the government one I just put there from our Constitution, right? Common defense, general welfare, and management of sort of the commons that the government oversees. And so these are kind of the different ways that these groups all enter into the economy, and where cooperatives sit in that, without, which I think is important to understand as we go through this, because it allows us to really center on how we're going to think about money and how we're going to think about member power related relationships within the organization. This is just a little fact I like putting out there. I probably should get it updated, but we often think of the dominant form of business as being investor-owned businesses, but the reality, there are 1 billion people in the world who are members of a co-op, and there's approximately only 328 million people who are shareholders. So when we think about the dominant form of business in the world, it's not necessarily investor-owned businesses. It might be small businesses like S corps and LLCs or partnerships, and then of course cooperatives, which represent approximately 1/8 of the population of the planet. And so we really are everywhere, and as co-ops, and we are a really vital part of the global economy. And we're not really a niche sort of business model. We're pretty well, we're pretty ingrained into the world economy. So where do co-ops come from? A quick history. I mentioned earlier about the Industrial Revolution, but also as like new extractive models were put in place. And this led to really rethinking how the social contract worked from a feudal economy to a market economy, and led to a lot of disruptions, and led to a lot of conflict as well. So workers were suddenly finding themselves pushed out of cottage industries into large factories, and unionization attempts were met with force by the factory owners or the government. Also, grocery stores, started forming, right, where markets were consolidating into these sort of defined grocery stores as we think of them today. Only grocers would use some predatory practices or poor practices, adding, I think one of the things I learned about the Rockdale Co-op is one of the things they first had to do was to teach consumers that flour isn't supposed to be white, because it became white because so many grocers would adulterate the wheat flour with chalk to gain a greater profit model, that white became sort of the accepted color for bread flour. for wheat flour, and that still is with us today, right? That white bread exists as an artifact of change in the Industrial Revolution. And so co-ops were seen as a potential way of overcoming this profit-driven model. And throughout the 19th century, the consumer and also the agriculture models really kicked into gear in North America, but also Germany. Credit unions started forming to give people more control over their financial institutions. When we get into the 20th century, movements such as the anti-Ganesh movement in Canada, which was mainly a producer, but also lobster fishers and other fisher fleets were coming together to use cooperatives to get a better share of the market, as well as here in the US, the Grange, which was pretty active also in the 18th and 20th or 19th and 20th century as well. In the worker co-op world, the big splash was in Spain, where a priest by the name of Arizmendiareda led some of his students into forming a worker cooperative factory during the Franco era of Spain that has now become the largest worker co-op in the world. I think they have 80,000 workers, maybe it's a little bit more. The number is always changing. And then also some of the effects of the change in technology were creating other problems. So when Silent Spring came out in the early 60s, this really led people to want to re-engage with organic farming and natural foods, finding there was no marketplace for that. There was no access to these foods in the traditional grocery stores. They began forming cooperatives to be able to source and get organic goods in the late 60s, early 70s. And that's where most of the consumer co-op movement came out of in the US. And then also fair trade started coming in as people in the 70s were getting concerns about, again, access to organic foods, but also making sure that we weren't exploiting the labor of farmers overseas. And so groups like Equal Exchange and started creating support for farmer co-ops, and then realizing that fair trade should also include fair work at home. And so Equal Exchange was one of the first of the fair trade worker co-ops to get started. And this kind of led to other worker co-ops forming in the 70s and 80s. And then today we have about 400, I think there's 468 identified worker co-ops today in the US. So yeah, and just kind of going into that, these are some of the I guess I can probably skip over the screen. I was trying to get these arranged today earlier, but the first co-op I will say in the US was actually started by Ben Franklin, and there was an insurance co-op. On some of the other players here in the West, we have the Grange, which is still active, and there's even a Grange co-op group in Oregon that runs supply stores. The Knights of Labor were also a big part of it in the worker co-op world, where in the 1870s they were their efforts were more about creating worker cooperatives than in a traditional, what we think of today as traditional labor management disputes. And then again, the crises of the Great Depression, but also the 60s and 70s lead to some of the more modern era of the cooperative today. And then most recently, some of the big changes that have happened is what I would just call crisis and response. It's essentially since 2008, there's been kind of a general economic crisis. We saw for some of you that might remember the recession of 2008. It was considered one of the worst economic crises since the 1840s, which was also when Rockdale was formed. This led to the Occupy movement. Also, the United Nations made 2012 the year of the cooperative, which really raised its profile. And then internationally, the cooperative movement also pushed for what they called the co-op decade. This led to a number of things, groups like Cooperation Jackson and Jackson, Mississippi coming together to try to replicate Mondragon in the US under kind of a US structure. Also, the timing of all of this is happening at about the same time that the baby boomer generation, those people born between 1946 and 1964, who are kind of the dominant group of small business owners, are starting to move towards retirement age and realizing that a huge percentage of small businesses are going to either be closing or disappearing if they can't find a seller or a new generation of owner. And this led partially to the Main Street Employee Ownership Act in 2018, which provides a mandate to the Small Business Administration and the Small Business Development Centers to support conversions to worker co-ops and other employee ownership models. And so it's something that, of course, was not necessarily funded in 2018, but and that's still something where we're working with SBDCs in our region to try to help them gain a greater understanding of co-ops and worker ownership, and also working to try to help businesses do that transition to the next generation of ownership so that we don't lose these businesses. Some other new constructs that are coming up are platform cooperation that are trying to reclaim sort of a democratic and user control space in the tech world. And most recently in New York City, Drivers Co-op got formed that is basically a worker-owned version of the transportation networking companies like Uber and Lyft. They have something, I think, like 5,000 or 6,000 drivers now that are members, making them the largest worker co-op in the US. And of course, the COVID response was pretty significant in how getting people to rethink about how they work. And it's being called the Great Resignation, but I think it's more about people wanting to take this moment and have that reflection of how they want to live their lives. And we're seeing a huge uptick in response of people wanting to have more worker co-ops. And this kind of ties in with a long-term study about what workers actually want. And it turns out what workers really want is agency in their work lives. They don't want to simply be a tool to be used by the employer. They want to have a voice. They want to have dignity at work. And so we are seeing this huge upwave now of new cooperatives and also converted cooperatives. And so hopefully we're at the very beginning of what will be a cooperative century. So, so what are co-ops really all about? The history is there. It's there's this core set of values and principles I mentioned earlier, that cooperatives as a business are really the only type of business model that has an internationally adopted set of values, principles, and a definition of what they are. Sometimes we also talk about it now as the cooperative enterprise model, and this is that co-ops are organizations that are people-centered, that focuses on the humans in the organization, the members, that they're jointly owned and controlled, and that they're democratically governed. So this is the core unit of what a cooperative is. Traditionally, we've talked about co-ops as being market failures, addressing market failures, but this cooperative economic model today is also about thinking about the community as a whole, the environment, and the economy, and that co-ops can't just be narrowly focused on the one place where there's a market failure. A really great example is the consumer grocery co-ops. When they started, they were addressing that market failure of access to organic and natural foods. And what they did was they actually created and rebuilt that marketplace to the point that groups like investor-owned groups like Whole Foods, now Amazon and Walmart, are coming in and threatening to dominate that market and leaving the co-ops with a certain existential crisis of what they're about. So they're having to rethink the role of a locally owned grocery store within a community. And this is where the co-op economic model, enterprise model, really works. It seeks to take those values and principles and then align it with the economic benefit and also values-based benefit to the membership in the community. And that these are the co-ops that are able to then thrive and really avoid succumbing to what we would call isomorphism in the marketplace, where they end up just feeling the pressure to grow and then looking and acting like their competitors and not really creating a co-op difference. And so that's one of the things that's important as we go through this, is thinking about what is that cooperative difference that your co-ops are going to be creating, and how can they use that then as to create an advantage in the marketplace by working on some of these values of solidarity and also engaging even non-members who are stakeholders. So for consumer co-ops, it might be local farmers that are really key stakeholders of the organization, even though they might traditionally be considered by other businesses as simply vendors. In the co-op world, we take a little bit more of a supportive role in those concepts and being good players in the market. So the co-op identity kind of started with Rockdale doing their principles, and then in 1995, as the Cold War was fizzling out, the international co-op movement came together and created the statement on the cooperative identity. About 10 years later, there was also a discussion about what a worker co-op is and what does that mean to be in a worker co-op. We won't really go through all of these, although I did put the readings in the shared folder. If you want to dive in and read about these statements, you can. And today, in 2025, they're reopening this statement on the cooperative identity for the first time in 30 years to talk about what's missing. So does there need to be specific principles around climate change and dealing with being good environmental stewards? Do we need specific language about diversity, equity, and inclusion? And over the next year or two, the international community is going to be having a global discussion over these issues and what it means to be a cooperative today and what that cooperative identity should include. So it's kind of a really exciting time to be in the co-op world, because there's a lot of thinking about it and what it means, and we're at a point of sort of a generational restating of who we are as cooperators. But currently, the definition for a cooperative is this: it's an autonomous association of persons united voluntarily to meet their common economic, social, and cultural needs and aspirations through a jointly owned and democratically controlled enterprise. And so one of the readings is a background paper for the statement on the cooperative identity, and the author, Ian McPherson, kind of goes through this in detail, which you're welcome to read through. But it is, some of the keywords here are democratically controlled, persons, right, which can be legal or natural persons, but also voluntary commitment, and then that it's not just economic, there are also social and cultural needs as well. The USDA also has a definition for cooperatives, and kind of more of a working definition. So also one that we can use is democratically controlled corporation that exists to meet the needs of its members. They exist on a cost-neutral basis, but the USDA has what they call the user principles. So in this case, the user-owner principle is that the people who own and finance the cooperative are those who use it. So member, again, who your members are should be the ones who are using the cooperative. And then likewise, the users of the cooperative services in a worker co-op, this might mean employment, right? The workers are using the co-op for their employment and income. So the people who control the cooperative are those who use it. And then finally, it should be the people who use the co-op are the ones who benefit from it. And so when we get into the money, we'll be talking about how this works with patronage refunds and such. But in a worker co-op, of course, part of this is being able to have the wages and benefits that the workers need, and doing so in a way that's sustainable for the business as a whole. And then at the international level, they have these sets of values and ethics. And so these, again, not to belabor them too much, but the idea that people are working together in sort of a mutual aid of mutual self-help, that people take responsibility for the success of the organization, that people engage equally, and also have access to the equity, but also making sure that that equity both in the social and the economic sense. So we're and then finally democratic basis, and then engaging in solidarity. And that means being able to work with people where there are common areas, and also supporting similar organizations and movements. Some of the ethics are really, there's a high level focus on transparency in cooperatives, especially worker cooperatives, that everyone is acting as an owner, and so they should have the ability to know what's going on. They should be honest with each other, and then a real focus on caring for others and social responsibility. And then a lot of this kind of dives into the principles too. So voluntary and open membership. Generally speaking, this means that people can't be forced to join the co-op, although in a worker co-op, this can mean different things. Sometimes worker co-ops will let people continue working there without being members. Other people say the voluntary part is choosing to work in the co-op. And if you choose to work in the co-op, then you need to be a member. That will be one of the discussions you'll need to have, is determining membership, and at what point, if you want, might have a probationary period, or what happens at the end of the probationary period if someone doesn't want to join the co-op. That'll be one of the discussions that you all need to figure out. Democratic member control, and this doesn't necessarily mean that every decision has to be made by vote, but it does mean that at some point the membership as a group comes together to set core decisions and decides how to work things forward. Likewise, member economic participation. It's the members who have to make the co-op work financially, and that means whether that means how much you pay in to get the co-op up and running, or to help the conversion, or also understanding in a worker co-op sense what your wages and benefits should be in order to keep the business sustainable, and if that's going to be viable for everyone. Co-ops are definitely their own organizations. They aren't necessarily locked into other groups, although they may join trade associations, but they're always independent. And then there should always be a focus on education, information, and training. One of the things that I see a lot is people coming and saying, we have this malaise of the membership, that our members aren't engaged, and usually it's because the co-op itself isn't really educating new workers on what a co-op is. And so building places in your organization to have continual education about the co-op model, making sure people have the information that they need to be able to make decisions, and then training, not just training for the job, but also training for managing and governing the co-op, are all important things to keep cooperatives vital and healthy. And then cooperation among cooperatives is sharing information. It's engaging in trade associations. In the US, we have the US Federation of Worker Co-ops, which is a really great organization. NWCDC is a member of it. One of the things they do now is they actually have a nice benefits package. They offer, in Washington, they offer health insurance, vision and dental, and I think disability insurance as well. So they have specific things, for a transactional relationship with the Federation, but also they offer networking. They offer access to peers likely in your field somewhere in throughout the country that you can reach out to and share information and learn from each other, and specifically for your sector. And personally, I can tell you it's always better to learn from other people's mistakes and then learning from your own. At least that's what I've tried to do. And then finally, concern for community. And again, being a modern co-op today is not just about a narrow focus on the members, but recognizing that the members are part of a larger community. And so that means wanting to be a good community steward as well. So real quickly, the co-op difference. I like this model just because it compares two Washington-based national businesses that both have reputations, good reputations, I guess, but also membership issues. So at Costco, as you probably know, you have to be a member to shop, and which by member they mean that you've joined their buying club. Whereas at REI, you don't have to be a member of REI Co-op to shop, but you may pay a surcharge, or you may not get a discount on the price. At Costco, though, the membership is only for shopping, so you don't get any voting rights. That's for the shareholders of Costco. So your benefit is restricted to basically the discounted pricing at Costco. And REI, in addition to your transactional rights as a member, you also are able to elect and serve on their corporate board of directors as well. So Costco, it's an annual fee to join. So your membership has to be renewed every year. And there's an extra fee if you want to get a rebate. So I think it's double the annual fee, and you get a certain percentage back on your purchases for the year. And REI, it's a one-time fee. I think it's still $20, and whereas Costco is $60 a year. But REI is a one-time fee, and the rebates start with the first dollar spent. And I think for them also at REI, I should say that I think voting requires that you spend at least $10 a year. At Costco, the shareholders don't have to be members. So you can own a share of Costco stock without ever shopping at Costco, and you're getting the benefits of the business without actually using any of the services or goods. Whereas at REI, all the shareholders, all the members who own REI are members, right? So it's if you're a member of REI, even if you don't shop there, you may not have voting privileges if you don't spend enough, but you're still a member of the co-op. And so basically that kind of gets back into the user thing, is that the people who use the co-op are the members and vice versa. And then, of course, at Costco, the shareholder power is based on the amount invested. So if I have 100 shares of stock, I have a tenth of the voting power of somebody who has 1,000 shares of stock. At REI, you get one share and you get one vote. And so, kind of in a crystallized way, this is how that co-op model separates from the traditional investor model, although also it really shows how the investor model has learned things from the co-op world and has found ways to try to take some of the best parts of that for their own marketing aspects. So that's kind of the big social definition of what a co-op is, and social definitions are really important because there are legal definitions, and we're going to talk about these next. And the legal definition is part of what allows you to either use the word co-op or not in your name, which can be really valuable, but there are a lot of different ways of doing co-ops from a legal standpoint, and these are determined on a state-by-state basis, and we'll be talking about the ones here in Washington. So the first one is the Revised Code of Washington 2386, Cooperative Associations. This is pretty much the standard co-op law. It's considered a for-profit corporation, which simply means that, again, it gets put into that camp, that the purpose of the organization is for profit. But since it's member owned and it's a cooperative, it'll focus on member needs, and profit isn't. It's still going to be acting as a cost-neutral organization. Any number of people or organizations can form a cooperatives. Directors and members, like with standard C Corp, are protected from liability. And you can either issue capital stock, or you can be a non-stock corporation. So if you do have capital stock, you can have multiple classes. You can have preferred shares. So you can set up your stock program in a way that you could raise capital from shareholders that may not be members. In preferred stock, where they wouldn't have any voting power, but anyone with voting stock then would be the voters. Non-stock is simply a membership fee. It's probably the easiest way to go about it. Again, those will be some of the things you'll need to think about as you go to setting this up. There's a registered agent, and this has to be either a Washington resident or corporation. And that's the person that the state is able to contact, who will be responsible for getting served notices. and that there's then an initial incorporator group and also initial directors, and you have a board of directors that is set by law, and then of course one member, one vote. And so this is kind of the basic co-op association. Within that, there's 2378, which is specifically for employee co-ops, and most of that law points at 2386. The distinction there is that membership is restricted to members, to people who work in the organization. I guess I just said, sorry, I forgot I had the screen here. So yeah, so the big distinction is, whereas in 2386, members of the co-op can be legal persons, which might, for instance, like Thriftway, right? The LLC that owns Thriftway is the member of the co-op, whereas in 2378, S corps and LLCs and C corps can't be members. It has to be a natural living human being person. Also, patronage refers to the amount of work performed by the member, as opposed to in a more standard cooperative, it's going to be about general usage. It could be sales, it could be a number of different things. And again, one member, one vote. For the rest of it, pretty much follows 2386. 2406 is called nonprofit, miscellaneous, and mutual corporations. So one of the big differences is the registration fee is a lot cheaper, but you know, it's like maybe I think the difference is like $75. It's considered a not-for-profit corporation. Again, this does not mean it's a charity. It doesn't mean it's a 501c3. It means that the purpose of the organization is not for profit, and that's just that distinction. So worker cooperatives and consumer co-ops can register under this, and they can use cooperative in their name, just like with 2386. They can also have either stock or non-stock model. They can distribute patronage back to the members of the organization, and they can be distinct classes of memberships. Again, members can either be legal persons, organizations, or natural persons. And likewise, there has to be, incorporators, and then a board of directors and registered agents. So that tends to follow the various different corporate models. There's a relatively new law called Limited Co-op Association. This one is designed, it follows models in other states where there are two major classes. So this is one where the users of the co-op can be investors. So you have patrons, and those are the people who use the services of the co-op. And then you have investors, who people engage with the co-op primarily by investing capital. So their use of the co-op is for profit, basically, return on their investment. So it's you probably would only really want this model if there's a reason that you had to create a lot of capital. A majority of the board has to be elected by the patron members, and a majority of the patron members must be in support of any membership votes. So investors tend to have a more limited role and a subordinate role to the patron members, but they do have some ability to veto on certain issues. And then investors can be paid dividends, while patrons would receive patronage. A person can be both a patron and an investor member in this structure, but they would have to identify which group they're voting with, essentially. And there's, if you want to go in this route, definitely this is a pretty unique route, and would have, you would want to think about exactly how you set it up. So it's a little bit more complicated than the other laws, because you are dealing with investors, and and that means you're probably coming under some investment laws as well as the traditional corporate law for cooperatives. Alternatively, there's also limited liability companies, LLCs. So they can operate on a cooperative basis. They can set up the organizational documents on a one member, one vote. Generally speaking, they can't retain equity, so they're pass-through organizations. That means at the end of the year, they have to distribute surplus, and if they need to do a cash call to get it back. They can be relatively expensive to maintain. You have to update your documents every time somebody enters or leaves the organization. So if you're in a relatively large organization for a co-op, it's probably not going to be very valuable. They tend to work better for small organizations How small, it's hard to say, but I would say, probably under 10, especially if, maybe, or if you have a really, really stable membership and where you don't have a lot of churn happening in the workplace. But because you want to minimize how much reporting you have to do, and if you miss a report, what happens? So definitely something to think about for smaller organizations. The members can be considered owners, not employees. This is kind of a little bit of a legal loophole, and sometimes you'll see LLCs in places where people may not have documentation to work in the U.S. but as an employee, but they can work as an owner, and so that is where sometimes you'll see more LLCs. So it can be a good option. I think sometimes in the conversion world, you might start as an LLC with a plan of converting it over once you get through the startup stage, because if you're a small group of 3 or 4 owners, you're at that place where the government would see you as owners, which means you can put in sweat equity. You're not as tied to fair labor standards and other rules around that employees are tied to. So it can be a good option if either you're really small or you need to avoid labor standards during the startup period, or you're in a position where the members simply can't be employees for whatever legal reasons there are. But when I say very small, I say 5 or less. There are other people that say 20, even or larger, but I think it's definitely for smaller organizations. So it's an option, and we do have examples of operating agreements that are written within a cooperative construct for LLCs, if that's the way you want to go. Okay, so I do want to say, all in all, there's really never been a better time to start or be part of a cooperative. Over the last 30 years or so, since 1995, there's been a wave of development among co-ops and co-op developers. So our organization has been around since the early 80s, but we really kind of kicked it into gear in the early 2000s. And along that time, also nationally, co-op development centers have grown and developed across the country and started talking to each other. There's networks now that didn't exist even 20 years ago, like the U.S. Federation of Worker Co-ops. There are graduate and educational programs now to help people learn more about co-ops and co-op management in specific. And so you're really doing this at the perfect time. Every day, I would say there's never been a better time to start or be part of a co-op. And so, real quick, if there are any questions or thoughts, maybe pause right here before I go on. Okay.
Yeah, I actually do have a question.
Oh, sure.
Sounds as if the structure, the legal structure, is independent of the governance of the organization. So you could have any kind of decision making, and it doesn't matter whether it's an LLC or whether it's under 2378 or 2386 or 2306 or 2406 or whichever it is, the operating documents or the I guess the bylaws or something of that ilk can be whatever you want. Is that right, or am I missing a point here?
There's a lot of latitude within that. You definitely need sort of a one member, one vote for the annual meeting. You can set up how big the board is and the powers of the board you can have. There's some co-ops I know where everyone who's a member is on the board of directors. So because they just don't feel the board, a group of called the board or a subgroup of the membership confers too much power onto that group. So like I know 2 co-ops where the entire membership is also the board of directors, where they have boards of 80 and 30 people. And then, so it just kind of defangs the board as a power institution within the organization. So, there's quite a bit of latitude, I guess. But yeah, but you would need those basic corporate structures.
Okay, thank you.
Any other thoughts, reflections? Okay, well, let's keep going. Okay, so one thing I do want to talk about, and this kind of ties into that, and is part of this week's or suggested activity, I should say, and that's about creating a vision and mission. As we're going through the conversion process, this is also an opportunity for the business to sort of reset, as you will, and as you're changing from either a single or a partnership organization to a cooperative organization, and new people are coming into the ownership structure. This is, I think, really valuable to sort of place this idea of vision and mission. So for nonprofits, again, for 501c3s especially, mission is really vital because that's part of how it gets its designation under the IRS codes. But I think for co-ops too, it's pretty important because you want to keep your focus on where the purpose of the co-op and what it's about. And so one of the ways I'd like to describe it is the vision is the big reason for the organization to exist, and then the mission is the method by which your organization works towards the mission. So in terms of vision, I'm using, I worked with Union Cab of Madison when I left the 250 member taxi cab cooperative in Madison, Wisconsin. And our bigger vision was to serve the community in such a way that we're considered a sustainable asset and valued resource by all. And that was how we wanted to present ourselves, how we wanted the community to see us, and what we would do to work towards that. So we did things, like and they still do on election days, they provide free rides to and from the polls for people, because that's part of supporting democracy in our community, and et cetera. But our mission was, that more narrow and more focused. And that was specifically, right, to create jobs at a living wage or better in a safe, humane, and democratic environment by providing quality transportation in the Madison area. So, it talks about what we're actually doing as an organization. And sometimes there are people that would say, we should start a new business, we should start a tavern, or we should start, something else. And it all comes back to, well, why, that's not what we do. We do transportation. And then also specifically, the mission of the organization, right, is not just to generate profit. It's not to create customer value per se. It's really about creating this safe workplace that enables the members to really thrive. And by doing that, then it feeds into the mission. And so I don't know if anyone has a vision or mission statement for their organization now they want to share, but it'd be great to hear what people are thinking about that, or if you've had a chance of doing some work around this already. I know some of the groups here today have already kind of started thinking about what the transition to a co-op is going to look like, but if anyone wants to share.
I'll share. I gotta pull it up first, second.
Sure.
Yeah, we have a mission statement. We don't have a vision statement, or this is the one that I wrote. We'll redo it. But Sound Audio Repair provides a fair and livable income to its employees and owners by selling audio repair services and DIY electronics workshops to individuals and organizations in Western Washington, and by selling used and refurbished audio equipment online. Sound Audio Repair succeeds by upholding the values of quality work, friendly service, and integrity in everything we do. Sound Audio Repair fosters community around, engagement with, and knowledge of DIY audio electronics in the South Salish Sea area.
That's great. That's great. I'm glad that you have one. It's really good to think about that. I'm wondering one thing that, where are you thinking? Do you feel? I'm trying to get my thoughts together here. How you might change it, or or are there thoughts? Do people feel they need to change it, or?
I'm not sure if it needs to be changed. I just want to make sure we go through a democratic process to arrive at our vision and mission. I think some of that could be moved out into a vision statement from the mission statement. So there could be, that concept of like the big and little mission makes sense to me. So, but yeah, I mean, it states what we do and what our values are currently, and I just want to make sure that everyone agrees on what we're doing and what our values are.
Yeah, no, that sounds great. Yeah, one thing I often like to encourage is having it be something that people can easily remember and recite out, but also, but it can be bigger too. So we also at Union Cab, in addition to our vision and mission, we also had our own core values that kind of dove in a little bit deeper on some of these things and what we meant by living wage, or what we meant by safety and that sort of thing too. So you can have sort of a whole values sort of policy or document that really kind of goes a little bit bigger, but then something that's more community facing is something where you can really nail it down, where people can quickly grasp and where it just can be said in a quick, not soundbite, but something where people can remember it easily.
That makes sense.
So yeah, there's any other volunteers? Thanks for volunteering. Appreciate that. Okay, well, let me just kind of go to the next. So for next steps, there's a couple of documents. One is 20 questions. Maybe I'll pull that up here in a second and kind of go through it. But the 20 questions was written by an attorney in the San Francisco Bay Area about things to think about, how you want the legal structure of the organization to look like, and some of the governance and decision making. And so one of the things I hope that over this week, as you're thinking about vision and mission, but also starting to think about membership, is working through those questions if you haven't already. So I know some people might have already seen it, and really sort of getting a sense of where there's commonality, where there's some differences, and how to work through that. Also, really thinking about, what's the membership of the co-op going to look like? Is it going to be workers, maybe workers and consumers, or maybe workers and suppliers? What within the worker construct is, probationary status? What would you feel be appropriate? And by probation, meaning that, when you hire someone new into the organization, how long would you want them to work there before they would be offered membership? Because, right, once they're offered membership, they become an equal member with everyone else. And so getting a sense of where that point is, what happens if somebody gets to that point and doesn't want to be a member, do they continue to work with the co-op? Getting some of those questions answered. And then, right, co-op vision and mission. And really, this kind of sets the foundation of what the new co-op's going to be. And so it will help really inform, this week will help really inform when we get into talking about the articles and bylaws and starting to setting up policies as we go through. So kind of what we're doing is, we're building up the new organization as we're getting ready to do the conversion. And then the next couple of weeks, we'll be talking about financial matters of doing the due diligence of understanding the financial numbers of the organization, making sure that the work of the owner is going to be covered. So, in terms of that, whether or not the owner is going to be staying on with the co-op. Sometimes they leave, sometimes they stay. But in any event, once it becomes a cooperative, then if the owner is leaving, then that person and everything they do needs to be replaced. So we need to make sure that that financial model accounts for having the owner replaced. And so in some conversions I work with, the owner was doing 60 to 70 hours a week and not really paying themselves a salary. So we had to work that back into the financial numbers. Even if they're staying with the organization, they're probably not going to have somebody working 60, 70 hours a week anymore. So you're going to have to divide up some of those duties and still see how that's going to work. So that'll be part of the discussion as we go through the financial part of it and doing the due diligence and making sure everything works. And so that's kind of where we are today. We have plenty of time if there are questions or if there's things that people are expecting that they didn't get today. Otherwise, I will assume that you are going to schedule time with the folks you're working with. So I believe Trillium's working with Diane, Peachtree's working with Louise, Sam is working with Sound Audio. I'll be working with Blue Heron, and we can set up times to meet over this next week. And then those meetings can either be in person or virtual, depending on what your needs are. I'm going to stop sharing my screen.